it's Baron Hoyk from One Chiropractic with Dr. Richard Barwell. We're talking about this thing called neurologically based chiropractic, and we are deep into the conversation. Hopefully you've been watching from the very beginning and got us to this point. Today we're going to really start talking about brain economics, right? We've been going through the different parts of the brain and the different systems of the brain. But today we're actually going to start talking about the overall toll that stress has on all of those systems together. So Doc, take it away.
Well, we'll start with just what happened last time and talking about brain overload. And I went into brain overload and couldn't come up with a word. And you went into brain overload going like, where in the heck is he going with all of this? And the biggest point with the last one is the fact that, you know, a traumatic brain injury, like going through the windshield of a car and having a skull fracture or, a massive brain injury, is no different than having a brain that's malfunctioning over a period of years. And it has severe consequences up to and including death. And so you have to understand that when we're talking about neurologically based chiropractic, that's the level we're dealing with. That's where we're coming from. And I want to sort of continue with that right today if we can. And I'll go to the first slide here, if we can get to this. Share, there we go. So we're back to talking about taking chiropractic from pain to brain. And to me, that's the most important message in what we're doing throughout this entire conversation is getting people to shift the concepts that chiropractic is all about symptom-based care. It's not. It's something much more than that. The symptom-based care we were caught in for so many years is based on the medical model because we had nowhere else to go. Especially when insurance came along, they had to have some sort of diagnosis, and we needed to get away from that. We need to get back to the roots of chiropractic. It said that chiropractic is really, truly about improved neurological function, not dealing with diseases and illnesses. It isn't the practice of medicine. And we fell into that trap mainly because of money coming back in from insurance billing. So let's move down to the next level here. And this is a paper that came out of Holland quite a while ago. And the first paper I got on this was in Dutch, which did me no good because it all looked Greek to me. So we had a fellow that spoke Dutch. He said, well, I can read it. I said, well, wait a minute, I think I can get it in English. And sure enough, I could get the paper in English. You can go online and get this paper. Talking to Michael Goodyear, Longyear, I should say, Michael Longyear at the Life Neuro Center. He's reviewed this paper as well, and he said, this isn't a research paper. This is like 48 pages long. He said that this is a publication on brain function, and it's incredible. And when I read this, I didn't sleep that night. I mean, I was so impressed with what these people were looking at and how they viewed brain function that it just knocked me out. So economics, housekeeping routines for the brain. If we don't understand how the brain works, how in the heck can we find out what chiropractic does to it? First, we have to go back and really study brain function. And the more you do that, the more exciting it is because we start to realize that we play a role that nobody else plays. So let me just talk about this for a minute. Now, when incoming impulses happen, it comes into the brain and it starts to overload the brain system. The brain only has a very limited amount of processing resources. So those things represent impulses coming into the brain, which are millions. I mean, what this brain can do is staggering, absolutely. But what happens is when you use up the processing resources of the brain to the point where incoming information can no longer find a place to go that it's supposed to go, it will find some other place to go. And it will then stimulate a response in that particular area of the brain. Well, because it went to an area that wasn't ideal for that information, and yet that area reacted, you've got bad results going back out. It's garbage in and garbage out. It's a computer model, and it just goes like, if information goes into your computer and gets stored somewhere where it shouldn't, and it causes a change in your programming, you got a problem. And that's exactly what happens within the human brain and the amount of processing resources. So that last little guy, he went into a stray area, and now we've got a problem because the brain has to respond. So integration. integration is about the processing resources, taking the information in, sharing that information back and forth through various areas of the brain so that it can then take proper action on it. And the integration of that sensory input is so important, and that it follows normal pathways. It goes into the thalamus and then gets shifted up to the prefrontal cortex and gets shifted to the cerebellum and gets shifted to other memory patterns throughout that system. And it happens in a nanosecond. The processing speed of the brain is staggering. I mean, there isn't a computer around that's built to act as fast as the brain can act. That's how incredible this thing is. So that integration has to follow pathways and has to exchange information back and forth, ideally, for you to get an ideal response. Does that make sense to you? It's very simple.
Nope. Yep. Totally makes sense.
Okay. So every task is based on sensory input before action. This is where the ADIO has a problem. Above, down, and inside out, they don't take in consideration that there has to be outside in information coming from. And that outside in can also be internal, coming from the digestive tract and going up in. But that outside into the brain is really, really important, because you've got to have that before any action will ever take place. Okay. So there has to be good sensory input. Processing resources of sensory input is critical and for the speed and the accuracy of the response. Well, both of those things really address survival value. For instance, speed. If you're standing in the middle of the road and you just realize that the bus is coming and you don't act fast enough, the bus wins. Okay? Accuracy, the bus is coming, I've got to jump. You only jumped 3 feet, you needed to jump 3.5.
Right.
Okay? So all of this is really critical information that has to be taken in and processed. So processing interference or neurological efficiency challenges can be caused by. What causes the interference? How does this brain get out of balance? Resource pool, limited reach. Women pride themselves on being multitaskers, and thank goodness they are, but there is a tremendous price that they pay because you're using up processing resources at a very high level. And that's why we find when we start doing EEGs on looking at brain function, we find that the majority of the brain functions out there are in an over-aroused state, that it's like locked into defense all the time. There's been a paper going around that talks about the heavy thinkers, or the people that do a lot of thinking don't live very long or don't live as long. I don't know if you've seen this. It's been going on the internet. Everybody's sending this thing back and sharing it. It's what we've been talking about for the last 15 years. And it seems, what really drives me crazy is I've been on the trail on this for more than 20 years talking about this, but it took an outside person, some medical research to show that what we've been saying is a fact.
Right.
We've had the answers. We just tend to ignore it because it moves us out of a comfort zone.
Right. So
resource pool, limited reach. Number 2, hierarchy of the task. So if you're busy walking across the street and you're looking at your cell phone and sending your message, and you walk into a car that's parked because you walked off the sidewalk, guess what? Hierarchy of the task. You've been so focused on one thing, you haven't been paying attention to anything else. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's another level that interferes with the processing resources. Cognitive demand and ability allocation. This is where Dr. Heidi Havoc really blew me away. I knew about this. I knew about the importance of the prefrontal cortex, but her work came along and just knocked me out. And so the prefrontal cortex is the conductor of the brain. It sets the tone for the rest of the brain. It works directly with the cerebellum, and we've talked a bit about that. And so if your cognitive demand, your ability to think under pressure is inhibited because it is highly sensitive to even a small amount of stress. And that means that the prefrontal cortex doesn't work well. That means the entire brain is not working well. That means your balance system doesn't work well. And so now the allocation of this information to go back and forth is going to be impaired. Lack of recovery. What kind of long-term patterns have you already built into your system that are doing this? And this is a real key here. because we all know that there's stress, and you can't get rid of stress. It's with us all of our life. There's some good stressors and there's some bad stressors. Mostly we're dealing with bad stressors. But if you build a pattern of response to a bad stressor that is now hardwired into the cortex of your brain, that means your recovery ability is hampered. And we are not recovering. And every time that we get into a situation where our brain cannot deal with the stressors properly and get it back to normal and recover from that, that means our survival value goes down and down and down.
So
okay?
Let me make sure that I understand, kind of dissect a little bit of what you've been saying, because I'm pretty sure I've got it, but I want to make sure.
Yeah.
So when we're dealing with the processing response, which is basically the brain's ability to do what it's supposed to do, to react to things, to process things, to get information, use it appropriately to produce an appropriate response. You know, we've talked earlier on in this area what stress does to different parts of the brain and the effect that it has. But if we're looking at it globally, at the end of the day, you know, when we have chronic stress and we create the long-term brain patterns, what you're telling me is that we're having patients that are coming in that they're in a state of long-term stress pattern, overload, you know, beta wave, that really the issue comes down to your body is supposed to be able to have a stressful moment and then go back into a relaxed state. So it's supposed to go into a sympathetic state and then into a parasympathetic state. It's supposed to adjust correctly. But when it has long-term patterns of stress and it believes that it has to stay in that beta phase forever in order to survive, when we don't have that adaptability, which is what's ultimately stressing out the system.
Exactly. And you know, here's what I get excited about. Listen to you talking. You've changed the conversation completely in your head about understanding what health and illness is all about. We're not talking about a bone on nerve. No. We're not talking about back pain. We're talking about something that's so much more important. And the cool thing about it is even the top neurologists in the world would understand exactly what you just said.
Yeah. And here's the exciting part about the adjustment, which we've talked about this before, but I'm just bringing it back because it gets me going, that it's about the right sensory input. And you made a comment earlier when you started this slide that sometimes we either have a lack of sensory input or the sensory input we're getting isn't good sensory input. And the adjustment provides the best sensory input, right? It provides the right type of information going in to shake up and create better neuroplasticity so that it can start processing and shuffling things up so that they start working appropriately, which gets us into that parasympathetic state. So if we boil all this down, it's about your body's ability not to adapt, not to go in and out of a stress and non-stress environment because it's getting the wrong sensory input and the body's believing a lie, which is a lot of what drugs does. It goes in there, it changes the sensory input and makes it believe things that aren't necessarily true. Well, just because I'm an idiot this way, but it's kind of like the superhero adjustment comes in and just straightens everything out and provides the proper input to allow that brain to get back into a normal cycle and processing the resources appropriate.
Simply put, yes, but I'm going to put a little twist to that.
All right.
Okay, because we're not smart enough to know what that particular brain needs from a neurological standpoint to move it to a better. So what it is, the adjustment is actually like a neurological pattern interrupt. It's like a shock wave. And because the brain cannot self-regulate, it gets stuck in these patterns, and it's no difference than sticking your finger into an electrical circuit and getting a shock and going like, wow. And that's why they use shock therapy, because it shocked the brain so much that the brain said, damn, I don't want that anymore. I'm going to do something better. Okay. But you killed a bunch of brain cells in the meantime because it was overload.
Right.
So sometimes it can be just a light touch. Sometimes that light touch can be vectored into a way that shows that this is the best response. We've witnessed this with people getting an specific upper cervical adjustment. And just let me say this, that the closer you are to the brain, the more impact you're going to have on that brain. So working on a toe doesn't have the impact that working on the atlas does. However, that particular person may need the work of the toe.
Right.
So we can't quite tell exactly what that is, but the more accurate that we can be in our application of chiropractic, the better the result. You know, and when I was in practice, I always heard that less is and later is better. But it never made sense to me because I was taught to just find the high spot, pound it down,
Right.
That's what I was taught. But when I started doing that in my practice and realizing that once people, and we're going to get into this, once people started to improve, I needed to change what I was doing because their neurological needs had changed. And we'll get into that big time later on and show you how you make your application in chiropractic more effective.
Awesome.
So the last part here is inappropriate system response. So here's what happens, and you're right. Once the system gets out of balance, that's going to then affect the sensory input. So now we're on a loop. Mm-hmm. And that's why we get these changes that go on with people that continue to break down, is because once the system isn't working right and the feedback now doesn't work right, that makes the outcome even worse. And we're into that safety pin cycle of going downhill. And eventually you're going to die.
Which is why it's important, especially in the beginning of care, because we're doing that pattern interrupt. The frequency in which adjustments are given should be a major factor in your determination for care for the patient, because we're wanting to continually create that pattern disrupt. And these guys that are seeing people, once a month and thinking that they're having an actual impact to the overall brain pattern, that's just not the case, which is why these people are in a chronic state of a condition, and it's always coming back, and it's always coming back because we're just not getting in there and creating enough input. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the majority of the patients that I had this incredible practice in my years of practice, I helped them out, but they'd all eventually come back with the same problem, only this time it'd be a little worse because they'd skipped a year or so. Yep. But it was the same pattern and the same pattern. I never changed the pattern. I just treated the symptoms. And the minute they felt better, care would end on their part, or go to once a month, and there was a reason behind that had nothing to do with clinical, but that's what we did. And it served me well. I had a great practice and good income out of it, but I could have done a better job for these people. And now, knowing this, that's the whole point of this talk. Right. So the next thing here, anything point you want to make?
Nope, you're good. Go for it.
Okay, foundation. This is the foundation. What we've just talked about right here, the brain economics and the overloading of the processing resources, is the foundation for the development of abnormal patterns of neurological responses. There's the true subluxation. And the only reason I'm using subluxation in this is because of the historical importance of the term subluxation in chiropractic. The subluxation is compromised neural integrity at the highest level. The vertebral subluxation is a symptom of the neurological subluxation.
Right.
And if we want to just, if you want to make your practice so that all you do is you take care of vertebral subluxations, I don't have a problem with that. If you want to do musculoskeletal approach, that's your choice. All I ask is that you don't limit the rest of the profession by your way of thinking.
Right.
That's important to me.
And you can still practice that way, just know where it comes from.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? Just help us out by not acting like that's where it all started and not explaining the patterns and the brain involvement, right? So, I agree with you completely.
We try to make ourselves right by sticking to that type of a talk, because that's the way we base our practice. And they're saying, well, no, you have a choice. My job is I want to just really relieve the symptoms and not address the cause. Hey, okay. The guy next door wants to deal with cause. Right. That's his business.
Yep.
So this provides a reasonable, coherent, and even a simple explanation. And even you can predict patterns of interference once you understand this, because we know what happens when a brain gets locked into defense mechanisms. We know that the sympathetics are going to light up like crazy. We can see the response. And we know that what's going to happen with them is they're going to end up having bad sleep patterns because they're stuck in beta. And so there's all sorts of things that are explained now because we understand it at a higher level, rather than saying, and this is where the chiropractors have a problem. When you talk about vertebral subluxation, they get focused on trauma.
Right.
They say, well, we know that there's other causes of stress. There's chemical and there's emotional, but no, that bone's out of place. That's trauma.
Right.
So how do you explain that? Well, the same way. That's a stressor, and it does exist. But what it does is it changes the brain pattern that creates that as a fixation now at that level.
Yep.
Okay? So differences in performance can be reduced or even eliminated with appropriate training. And this is right out of that brain economics. This was a paper on chiropractic that chiropractors should be made to read when they're in chiropractic classes. And the key word is appropriate. So are you doing appropriate care in your office? If we can determine the source of the interference to the processing resources, and get this, and measure the outcome of this interference, then we'll be able to measure the effectiveness of the care from an appropriate application. Holy smokes. That's what drove me. When I started to realize, when we did our research, and I realized that the brain was being interfered with and had bad patterns, and we could actually measure and look at those patterns, I went like, oh, wow, if we can see abnormal patterns in the EEG area and the cortex of the brain, and we can see abnormal patterns such as high blood pressure or cold hands or tight muscles or bad breathing or bad heart rate variability. We had all those things that we could look at and say, yeah, it's not right. Well, if we can measure that, then we can do whatever we need to do and remeasure, and we should be able to see a change. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a piece of equipment that could do that. There was nothing in the market. And so we went ahead and we developed this. We worked with companies with the best reputation and with this type of instrumentation, and we set it up and did it ourselves. They're kicking themselves because they didn't do it, and I owned it. And so we had this. And when we did this, I was lit up. I was lit up saying, we finally got an answer for the profession. We can show changes in brain function at the highest level from a chiropractic adjustment, pre-post care. I said, this is it.
Yeah, because
pardon?
I said we're all about, like, the X-ray was our thing, and then we got into surface EMGs was our thing, and then we got into, some people got into nutrition and blood testing was our thing, and then we've always wanted our thing like medicine had. Medicine always had something they can poke and prod and come back with a piece of paper and say you're sick. Chiropractic really never had that, right? We've tried, but we've never had anything that could stand up to any amount of scrutiny. Even the X-ray is a static view, right? We interpret it very differently than the medical community, but it's still a static view, which doesn't necessarily support why you're adjusting to the length that you're adjusting. Surface EMG obviously has been thrown out. Dynamic EMG, it's a heat gradient. So, we've never really had things. Then we've started to get into things like heart variability, which I know is a big part of what we're looking at here as well. But the fact that the Neuro Infinity is able to capture the different aspects of the brain patterns is new. It is different in our profession, which is why you've been scoffed at for so many years, because people don't understand it. They've never thought about it at that length. But I agree with you. This is an actual tool to document and show the patient, show yourself, and actual data that you can use that's going to actually affect your methodology in treating the patient rather than finding the bump and pounding it down.
Yeah, and the thing is you take a look. You take a look at X-ray, and you take a look at SEMGs, static paraspinals, take a look at thermal paraspinals. Not only are they static, but they were locked into the old way of thinking that it was about vertebral subluxation and bone on nerve.
Right.
And the nervous system ended at C1.
Right.
And so I was so excited about this, saying, this is the answer. And somebody asked me a question. One of our instructors, as a matter of fact, asked me a question. He says, well, what is your intent? Is your intent to change the profession, or is it to sell Neuro Infinities? And I said, they're attached because one is means to the other. If you can't measure it, if you don't have any kind of accurate, acceptable measurement for pre and post, then it's just a bunch of great ideas. Mm-hmm. And so that's why the development of the Neuro Infinity came along, was to say, we have to have the measurement. If we don't have it, all this is really great information, but how do we bring that into practice? Because the patient is going to say, well, I understand that you're working with my brain, but can you prove it?
Right.
And the answer is an X-ray doesn't prove it. Does it have value? Sure it does. It's a great history lesson, and if you're really good at it, you can pick up a bunch of abnormalities on the X-ray.
Yeah.
But if you're depending on that as the foundation for chiropractic, we're locked into
the old mindset.
Skeletal.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
So what do we got? Well, I'm going to take this to another level. How are we doing on time on this one, Doc?
We're okay.
Good. Doc, look at that. To me, you are. I just accept you because you're a chiropractic advocate extraordinaire. I give you that honorary degree.
I appreciate that.
Homeostasis to allostasis. We talked about homeostasis in chiropractic forever and a day. There's a book out there called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky. And if you haven't read it, I suggest that everybody get it and read it. Because he really brought the term allostasis to life and the difference between the two of them. So we need to take a look at this. Homeostasis, a physiological process where an organism maintains a constant balance of physical or chemical factors in their internal environment. It's a static point, and everything's in balance, and it's beautiful. That's where we want to be. But there's something that's missing with this. There's a formula that's missing in this, that's missing in most of the concepts of chiropractic. And that is when I talked about universal intelligence. Remember that? Way back there, we talked about universal intelligence, that we live in a constant changing environment that is deadly to us. And we need to be able to adapt. Well, the goal of homeostasis is to maintain a set point of body function down to the cellular level. It's a set point. It's an ideal. But it's static, just like static X-rays or static SEMGs. It's a moment in time on an individual that lives in an ever-adapting world. Allostasis, the goal of allostasis is to maintain that optimum point in a changing environment. That's what this brain does. This brain is getting all this sensory input saying, okay, you've been sitting in this position too long, you need to move. My butt is already telling me that I'm not sitting in a good position because I'm getting that information and I need to change it. So it's more dynamic and more an adaptive process than homeostasis. Well, if it's more dynamic and more adaptive, boy, we better apply to that or relate to that with chiropractic. It allows for functional efficiency during variable states. Okay? The allostatic response. Increased arousal in the response to a stressor via those accesses I was talking about before, the HPA axis, the SNS axis, and the vagus nerve. That's our sensory input information that goes all the way up to the brain and comes all the way back down in order that it's an axis, it's an input-output that allows us to adapt to this ever-changing environment. So recovery from a stressor is just as important as the response to it. In fact, I think it's even more important than the response to it.
And I want to stop on that for half a second because, man, that sentence rings so true. The recovery from the stressor is just as important as the response to it, right? So if I see, a car is coming and my child's in the street, the stressor is me freaking out, going out and grabbing my kid out of in front of that car, even if it means myself gets hit, right? That's a stressor. So that, obviously, I needed that quick response. My body needed to go into Superman mode, and I needed to go do that. It was necessary. But even though that was necessary, my ability to come back, take a deep breath, and get back into an appropriate state for survival overall is actually more important than the stress that I created to save my child, right? I mean, in the big picture, we have to understand that recovery process allows us to have that stress response in the future. If we don't ever come out of that stress response, then you never can go into another one because you're in a constant state and you won't have that ability to react to the level, which is what we were talking about with the processing resources, right? If we're in a constant stress response, how do you go to another level of stress response when you need it if your body's already in a stress response? So, man, to me, this is everything. And this is, again, where the adjustment comes in to break up that pattern and allows your body to get out of that cycle of stress. To me, that sentence is the statement, right?
Yep, and this is why I spend so much time on this side of how it was created. Dr. Havoc really shows about the adjustment. When you get to hearing her, I mean, she'll go on for 7 hours talking about what the adjustment actually does from a neurological level. And I just, when I give her to listen to her programs and stuff, I'm making notes so much I run out of paper. But I went back and said, these guys have to understand how all this started in the first place in order to be experts about how to deal with it.
That's right.
The chiropractic adjustment is too great a gift. It's too darn easy for chiropractors to just get good results when they could get phenomenal results if they would just understand the process behind all of this and understand where their power really lies.
Awesome.
Okay. So, function nervous system, sensory input, gathers information, sends it inside, outside, and inside the body, sends it in for processing. Whoops. Sends it in, so get down here. There we go. Integration to process. That's where it goes up into the brain and deals with all of the brain areas, the various parts, and they agree on one another and they send out what they consider to be the best response that they've got. And we have motor output, and that feeds back into the sensory. That's the way it works. That's the ideal loop.
Hey, Doc, we're stuck on sensory input on this side.
Oh. Okay, share screen is being paused. Don't pause that. How do I get out of that? Oh, wait a minute, I'll try that thing. There. Did that come?
Nope. Stop sharing and then go back into sharing, maybe.
Stop sharing. Okay. My cursor got a little too far up. Oh, right here. Okay. Well, okay, come on. Share. Something's gonna happen. Share. What's it doing now?
Nothing. Still just you and me.
Okay. I knew this was going too smoothly.
Well, maybe this is a natural part to break, and we'll come back to it in the next session.
All right, maybe it's a good spot to stop here because then we can go back on it. I don't understand what happened there.
That's all right. That's technology at its finest. But listen, guys, well, you can see we're human, and you can see we're doing this, just the old-fashioned way. So we appreciate your patience with us on this. But listen, go back and keep rewatching this information. There's a lot of stuff here. And remember, when you're inviting your colleagues to join this series, please encourage them to start from the beginning. This isn't one of those things that you can just pop in the middle and grab what we're talking about, because it does build on itself. So we hope you're enjoying this series. Next week we'll come back. We'll pick up where we left off and review this sensory input. But we appreciate, we love you. Dr. Barwell, as always, thank you so much. And we'll see you on the next session.
Okay.